Hey there, everyone. Today we're going to talk about a disappearance that I think quite a few of you will already be familiar with. I've covered the case of Mark Strittmater on this channel before, but only very briefly. I think more of you will be familiar with this case if you've seen the recent movie Missing 411: The UFO Connection. Mark's case was prominently featured in that film, and I would say it was certainly hinted at that his disappearance may be attributed to UFO abduction. Coincidentally, Mark Strittmater's remains would be found about 1 month prior to the release of the Missing 411 movie. Once remains are found, it tends to become more likely that the authority in charge of the investigation will release their records associated with it. Luckily, I was able to get the reports for Mark's case, and I'd like to thank the Carbon County Sheriff for charging me an arm and a leg for them. So the idea is, I'm going to present Mark's case to you, and all of the relevant facts collected, and then I'd like you, the viewer, to decide whether or not you think Mark was the victim of a UFO abduction scenario. But before we get into the story, I just want to add a notice that there will be some personal information mentioned in relation to Mark Strittmater. I never do this lightly. While the information is personal, it is also key to fully understanding the nature of this disappearance, which has, at times, been labeled as paranormal. In order to better learn why people go missing, I think it is also important to learn as much as possible about the missing individual themselves. So let's take a look at this case. Mark Strittmater was 44 years old. He was a resident of Saratoga, Wyoming, and an experienced hunter. Mark lived with his girlfriend of 13 years, Kimberly Mace, whom he often hunted with. Mark had recently been working out in Gillette, Wyoming as a pipe welder, but returned home to Saratoga briefly, arriving home around 1 a.m., before setting out that same day, October 19, 2019, to go hunting alone in the Medicine Bow National Forest. This was an area he was familiar with and had hunted for the past 30 years. Kimberly would later state that she last saw Mark around 5:30 in the morning, the day he left for his hunt. Mark was driving a rented 2016 white Dodge pickup truck as he traveled into Medicine Bow National Forest. He was wearing a light camo shirt, gray pants, and a bright orange hat. Mark was last seen at a come-and-go on his way into the forest at 5:46 a.m. The Medicine Bow Route National Forest consists of over 2 million acres of land, which covers territory in Wyoming and Colorado. It is also a combination of 3 separate areas: the Medicine Bow National Forest, Route National Forest, and the Thunder Basin National Grassland, which were all combined in 1995. Mark's plan was to hunt in the section to the southwest of Saratoga. It is unclear how long Mark was intending to hunt, or how aware he was of the weather forecast that day. He ventured out on his hunt, carrying only his rifle and a backpack containing smaller items, and perhaps some food and water. Any heavier clothing Mark had was left in the truck. At around 11 a.m., Mark attempted to call Kimberly, but she didn't answer. He would later text her saying that he had shot an elk but believed he missed. The exact words of the text were, "I'm done, I suck. Missed a nice 5-pointer small 6. Then a small 5-pointer ran in a perfect broadside. Shot even closer but walked down to find." Kimberly received the text while she was in Rawlins, watching her grandchild for the day. A serious snowstorm would roll into the area where Mark was hunting during this time, dropping between 4 to 6 inches of fresh snow in the area. Kimberly indicated that Mark was aware of the impending snowstorm and assumed he would try to make it out of the area before it hit. Later in the evening, she would text Mark asking if he had made it back to Saratoga. She did not receive a response, and the message indicated it wasn't delivered. When she tried to call Mark, the phone would go straight to voicemail. Kimberly would not return home until Sunday, October 20th. When she arrived, she realized that Mark had not made it back yet. Kimberly initially went to the Saratoga Police Department to see if any accidents had been reported. The Carbon County Sheriff's Office was notified around 3:44 p.m., whereafter a deputy went to meet with Kimberly at Saratoga PD. She informed him that she was going to head out to the area to look for Mark, since she had not heard from him since the snowstorm had hit. At that time, she declined the sheriff's offer to launch a search and rescue. Afterwards, she traveled up to the Deep Jack Road area where Mark often went hunting. She came across Mark's truck at the intersection of Forest Road 801 and Forest Road 830. She would later tell authorities that Mark never usually went this far down the road because there were too many people. The truck, as she found it, was completely covered by a lot of snow. The snow around the truck was untouched, indicating that nobody had been around it since the snowstorm hit. Kimberly went inside the vehicle and found Mark's cell phone, wallet, spotting scope, cooler, and cigarettes. She found Mark's keys in the truck's fuel door, which was his normal place for hiding them. The only things that were missing were his rifle, hunting pack, and Mark himself. The fact that Mark's cell phone was found in the vehicle seemed to indicate that he returned to the truck at some point, put the phone inside, and then went back out again. Kimberly checked the fuel level on the truck and also started it up. There was no indication that there was anything mechanically wrong with the vehicle, and no indication of where Mark may have traveled. Kimberly then returned the keys to where she had found them, and left the truck for the authorities. She would officially call and report Mark as missing at 7:42 p.m. Carbon County Sheriff's deputies showed up in the area around 9:15 p.m. The only tracks they could find in the fresh snow were from Kimberly. They confirm in their reports that they found Mark's keys and cell phone in his truck. They also found a receipt from the come-and-go Mark stopped at the morning he disappeared. This receipt led deputies to the security footage of Mark when he was at the convenience store. Deputies also spoke with any campers they could find in the area, but none of them reported seeing Mark or anyone near the area where his truck was parked. Kimberly was called by a Carbon County Sheriff's deputy that evening, where she gave some detailed information on Mark and his hunting practices. Kimberly said she was concerned because Mark left his heavier winter clothing back at their residence. She also said that Mark usually takes snacks and water with him, but she was not sure if he was prepared for the severe snowstorm that arrived rapidly in the area. Kimberly did not believe that Mark was in a bad mental state at the time and didn't think he was taking any medications. Sheriff's deputies decided to call in searchers with four-wheelers and trucks. Immediately, they ran into problems because of the weather in the area. The snow had wreaked havoc on the roads, delaying some searchers from reaching the site. Other resources that were to be used in the air were grounded because visibility was so poor. Air searches were performed only on an intermittent basis when weather allowed for it. Ultimately, the search turned up nothing of value and the operation was suspended on October 26th. A number of important incidents and interviews occurred during the week of the search. On October 21st, a deputy met with Damon and Gary Taylor. Gary Taylor is Kimberly's brother, and Damon is his son. They had apparently collected some of Mark's personal items from his truck at some point and were forced to give them back. They returned the items in the soft-sided cooler from Mark's truck. It contained Mark's wallet, some medication, food, drink, the spotting scope, and his phone. The food and drink contained in the cooler consisted of 2 bottles of water, 1 bottle of Powerade, and a Lunchable container. Ultimately, we don't know what food or water Mark took with him when he left the truck, but possibly none. The prescription medication that was in the truck is also listed later in the report. They found 2 empty prescription vials of diazepam and hydroxyzine, 1 prescription bottle of alprazolam about 3/4 full, 1 prescription bottle of hydroxyzine about 3/4 full, and 11 pouches of buprenorphine naloxone films, commonly known as Suboxone. While I am not a doctor, I can say that these medications together are a very common treatment for opioid addiction and withdrawal. Deputies would also later learn that there was a gun removed from the truck as well, and it was not returned along with all of the other items. On October 22nd, detectives interviewed Mark's father, Mike Strittmater. Mike believed it was unlike his son to become lost, as Mark used to be a guide and was a survivor. Mike also told authorities that his son had a history of drug use, which he was seeing a doctor for. He told authorities that Mark was taking prescription medication to stave off withdrawal symptoms from drug abuse. It would appear that Kimberly was either unaware of this fact or unwilling to reveal it to authorities when interviewed. Mike would describe his son's relationship with Kimberly as a fairly normal long-term relationship. On November 6th, Mark's half-sister, Jenny Barr, called the sheriff's office and stated that she had received some texts from Mark on October 13th. The texts indicated that Mark got into a confrontation with a couple of hunters that stole a deer he shot. Apparently, guns were pulled and Mark shot around into the air, which caused the other men to run off. Detectives approached Kimberly with this information and asked her what her recollection of these events was. Kimberly said that they were out deer hunting, and when Mark shot a deer, they went to see if it was hit. When they got to the area, they found two guys in a red Chevy truck, and they had already loaded the deer into their vehicle. Mark and the hunters then exchanged words, and the guys drove off. Detectives asked Kimberly if guns were pulled, and she indicated no, just cussing back and forth. Some additional searching appears to have taken place on November 8th, when the sheriff brought at least 4 dog teams into the area. They would return without any success. Detectives contacted Kimberly Mace again on November 13th to re-interview her. Nothing she said contradicted her prior statements to deputies. She also provided them with pictures of Mark's rifle as well as his tattoos. About 8 months later, on July 13th, 2020, authorities contacted Kimberly Mace once again to see if there was anything else she could add to the case. This time, Kimberly told them some previously unknown information, that Mark may have had cancer or a mass of some kind in his nether regions. Kimberly seemed quite uncertain of the exact diagnosis of this ailment and was unable to find any medical records to verify the status of Mark's health. She stated that she eventually stopped trying to talk to Mark about it because the subject made him so upset. Kimberly advised detectives to contact another individual whom Mark had been spending a lot of time with in Gillette if they wanted to learn more information. On July 22, 2020, a deputy interviewed Kimberly's brother, Gary Taylor, about his involvement with the search and rescue operation. Gary said he attempted to participate in the search for Mark. He recalled a lot of people being there, but most of them he didn't know. He tried to help search, but the snow was so deep that he wasn't able to get very far in the brush. Since he couldn't search, he decided to go and check on Mark's truck, where he then removed a bunch of Mark's belongings in order to keep them safe. When asked if he remembered anything else from that day, Gary said that he recalled seeing a man talking to some deputies. This man said that he had seen Mark in the area and that he believed Mark was intoxicated and wandering around, so he left him alone. Gary said he believed the man saying this appeared intoxicated as well. When asked about his relationship with Mark, Gary stated that they used to hang out a lot, but no longer. About a year prior, Mark got meaner, and Gary didn't think Mark was treating Kimberly and others very well, so their friendship lapsed. Gary was then asked if he knew anything about Mark's current health situation, and he stated that Mark had a prescription drug problem, but he didn't know what drugs Mark was abusing. On October 23rd of 2020, a hunter was walking out near the area where Mark's vehicle was found when he discovered binoculars lying on the ground. The binoculars were determined to be Mark's and were found about 2,000 feet or less than half a mile from where Mark's truck was discovered. The sheriff reportedly performed a search in the area using canines, which subsequently turned up some smaller items possibly belonging to Mark, but the search is not detailed in the sheriff's report. On August 29, 2021, nearly a year later, a search and rescue team consisting of 12 members went out to the area where Mark disappeared and spent the day there. They found the remains of a shirt, but it was uncertain whether it belonged to Mark or not. On August 31, 2021, detectives received information that there were 2 hikers that encountered Mark on the day he went missing. They called a man named Jacob Anderson and asked him about their interaction with Mark on the day of the bad snowstorm. Jacob and a man named Cameron were walking in the area and scouting for animals but hadn't seen anything. They got to the roadway and were heading back to their camp when they encountered Mark Strittmater driving his white pickup. Mark stopped beside them and asked if they needed a ride. Jacob felt that Mark was under the influence of something as he was acting a little off, so he told Mark they didn't need a ride. Mark then drove off. Jacob and Cameron walked back to their camp approximately a mile away. Later that evening, Jacob was out with his father and they were driving around the area. They saw Mark's white pickup truck parked where it would eventually be found by authorities. While the duo were driving around, the snow started to fall, and it continued to get worse as the evening went on. More than a year would pass before another update happened on Mark's case, when on October 16, 2022, a Carbon County Sheriff's deputy responded to a call of found property at the Sandstone Cabin off of Highway 70. This location is roughly 5.5 miles from the point where Mark's vehicle was found. Upon arrival, the deputy learned that a Mr. Christensen and his nephew had been chasing a herd of elk when his nephew noticed a rusty rifle partially under a tree, which they had to dig out. Nearby, they also noticed a backpack and what appeared to be clothing and a boot. Mr. Christensen flipped the backpack over and found a hunting license belonging to Mark Strittmater. He brought the gun and hunting license back with him and attempted to report the find to the game warden. Mr. Christensen gave detailed information about the rifle, including that it had one bullet in the magazine. He describes the bolt as being up and shut, and he needed to tap it on a log to get it open. He also said that he could see the rifle had been fired. He could not remember what position the safety was in when he found the gun, but believed it may have been in the firing position. Pictures of the rifle seemed to show a shell still lodged in the chamber. The deputy and the game warden then proceeded to the coordinates given by Mr. Christensen, where they came upon the clothing and items. After searching the area, they also found a jawbone and some arm bones still inside a vest. They searched the surrounding area out to approximately 15 to 20 yards, but did not find any additional remains. Pictures of the area seemed to show quite a few pieces of clothing, bits of fabric, a hat, and other small items, including a rangefinder and what appears to be a knife. The coroner would later arrive to collect the clothing and remains. Because the remains were in such an advanced state of decomposition, the cause of death was not readily apparent, and nothing at the scene seemed to indicate foul play. The coroner positively ID'd the remains as Mark Strittmater, likely using the jawbone and comparing it to dental records. Ultimately, the coroner was unable to determine a cause of death, which is not surprising. Afterwards, the case was considered closed as no evidence pointed towards any sort of criminal activity. So what happened to Mark Strittmater? Was he abducted by a UFO and then returned at some point later? Or did he simply get lost in a snowstorm and subsequently die from exposure? I suppose it's worth asking, since the question has been brought up before, about whether or not Mark was the victim of a UFO abduction. It is certainly a difficult thing to try and prove, since there really is no evidence to support it. If you watch the Missing 411 movie, then you may recall Mark's girlfriend, Kimberly, was interviewed. And unfortunately, the editors of this movie failed to double-check the spelling on Kimberly's last name. No judgment here, though. I realize little things like that can happen to the best of us. Anyway, in the movie, Kimberly recalled an instance where Mark believed he saw a UFO while out hunting. That, however, is not evidence that UFOs took Mark, but rather an instance where he had a sighting in the past. There was also an incident many years prior to Mark's disappearance, where a man named Carl Higdon reported that aliens abducted him while he was hunting in Medicine Bow. I suppose an argument could be made that the same occurred to Mark simply because of the proximity, but I still think you have to weigh all of the UFO stuff against the more tangible factors. We have to ask ourselves, what role, if any, did the medications play in Mark's death? Now, if you've followed this channel for some time and are anything like me, you're probably thinking that this case sounds very familiar. The Aaron Hedges case we've covered previously on this channel was yet another case of a hunter whose substance addiction may likely have been a key component in the reason he became lost and died. But I want to make one thing quite clear. I am not suggesting that Mark's potential opiate addiction was the cause of his death. Aaron Hedges' case was actually quite a bit different. He had a problem with alcohol, and the withdrawal from that can come on fast and strong. It was that withdrawal, in my mind, that played a key role in his demise. Mark's case differs a bit in that I do not think he was going through opiate withdrawal when he died. Now, obviously, it's impossible to be certain of anything because we have no toxicology for Mark. But consider this, opiate withdrawal is one of the worst things imaginable. And if it were to happen to someone while they were lost in the wilderness, then they would effectively be helpless. They would be terribly sick and suffering. Now, I don't want to get into too much detail about medications, but it's worth explaining a little bit about what Mark was taking. First, he was taking Suboxone, which is often used to treat opiate addiction, as it acts as both an agonist and antagonist on the brain's opioid receptors. This combination of buprenorphine and naloxone staves off withdrawal for someone trying to come off of other forms of opiates, like oxycodone, for example, while also preventing the individual from being able to get high. In theory, someone taking Suboxone should not be able to use other opiates to get high, but results may vary for different people. One component of Suboxone is that it has a fairly long half-life, meaning it takes a while to completely be eliminated by the body. So if Mark was lost in the wilderness, he likely wouldn't feel the full effects of withdrawal from Suboxone for some time. After 24 hours, he might feel about 90% his normal self. After 48 hours, he might be at 70 or 80%. It would be a slow onset. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that in my opinion, it is unlikely that opiate withdrawal was a causal factor in his death, unless he survived past 3 or 4 days, which I would contend is unlikely. Now, Mark was prescribed diazepam, also known as Valium, and hydroxyzine. Hydroxyzine is generally prescribed as an antihistamine, but it also commonly is used to treat the symptoms of opiate withdrawal. It has a list of side effects that are comparable to most other antihistamines, and taking it with alcohol can enhance the effects of both. Now, diazepam or Valium, many people are probably familiar with. People who take diazepam can often exhibit behavior similar to what one would expect from drinking alcohol. Drinking alcohol while on diazepam can also increase the effects of both. Mark also had quite a bit of alprazolam or Xanax, the effects of which are very similar to Valium. Reports indicate that his regular medications were Valium and Suboxone. Recall that the witness, Jacob Anderson, who ran into Mark while he was walking on the roadside with a friend, said that Mark appeared to be intoxicated, so he refused the offer for a ride. I am less certain that Mark was actually drinking, and am more of a belief that Jacob was perhaps witnessing the effects of the diazepam Mark was taking. Again, this is guesswork, but it does seem to fit. Well, let's examine a list of some possible things that were working against Mark the day he disappeared. First off, he arrived home in Saratoga at 1 a.m. in the morning, after driving from Gillette, where he was staying for work. That is a distance of nearly 300 miles and takes approximately 4.5 hours to drive. So Mark got home at 1 a.m. He would then leave for his hunting trip 4.5 hours after that. Now, you would have to assume at least some of that time was spent prepping for his trip, gathering his gear, food, water, and other things. Did he rest at all before the trip, or was he running on very little sleep? I suppose the answer is we don't know. But that timeline does make me wonder. We know that once he got out into the hunting area, the only witnesses to actually see him also believed he was intoxicated. Support for these claims of these witnesses comes from the fact that the medications found in Mark's truck are fully capable of producing symptoms that could make someone appear intoxicated. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, a bad snowstorm quickly hit the area, dropping around 4 to 6 inches of snow. Mark was unprepared for this weather when it came to both his clothing and his survival resources. He had no heavy winter clothing and minimal food and water, if he had any at all. Consider combining all of these factors and weighing them against things like Mark's hunting experience and knowledge of the area. Is it possible that these factors had a cumulative effect which led to Mark's untimely death? It is a question I pose to you, the viewer. Was this a case of abduction or misadventure? One more thing to consider is that if Mark was abducted, then obviously he was returned at some point. But the trail of gear he left behind would seem to indicate someone who traveled on foot rather than someone being taken up into a UFO and then later placed into a location. Ultimately, I want to hear what you think. Is it more likely that Mark was abducted by a UFO, or did he simply fall victim to a series of unfortunate circumstances? I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this case, and until next time, thanks for watching.